Okay, well, thank you, Alexi, and thank you everyone for being here today. And I feel very privileged to be the first person here speaking at the conference. And again, we're talking about trends in higher education and digital creativity. And I'd like to start by just talking about proven frameworks for online instructional design. And just a little bit of background. I am working at the University Duisburg-Essen, and together with many universities here in the area, I started in 2007. Not only do I do instructional design, but I also do learning environment design. And so here you see some pictures of the Language Learning Center. Was a combination of work of many different universities doing a very positive learning environment for teachers. We did this for almost 15 years. And it's the basis for what I'm going to present today. I was so excited about what we created, so I wanted to take that show on the road. We took it to Japan, we took it to Greece, we took it to Germany, all over Germany, Russia, Italy, France, and the UK. And just wanted to share my ideas of what we had learned at the Language Learning Center with teachers all over the world. And my goal was to, just invite teachers to join that CLIL, TBL, PBL, EMI, all that, with an interdisciplinary content approach and flipped learning in an online learning world. And I called it my student engagement party. And, through my journeys, I discovered a lot of things. But at a conference in Japan, I was asked the question, who is a contemporary teacher? And anyone who knows me knows I like mind mapping. And I actually drew this mind map, just as as the answer to that question. But you'll see in the middle, which I thought was the most important thing, was that we, really, if we consider ourselves a contemporary teacher, we need to be methodology savvy, and we need to take, constructivist approaches to really how we're, how we're doing things, and what we're doing. And through my travels, no matter where I was at, I always made it a point to meet students and see what the students were saying and what they were thinking. Because, we concentrate so much on teaching that we sometimes forget about the students and learning. So, I've met students, again, in all the different countries that I visited. And, one thing that I saw that students were seeking was that sense of belongingness, that sense of being part of that learning process, and also teaching process. And another thing that I learned from students was that they had questions about what was going on. Now, as a, organizational psychologists, we call those questions of mystery, and those happen in any organization. But, they happen a lot in the students' heads, and they're questions that sometimes they're afraid to ask. And this is just a list of some of the questions that I was able to elicit from students as they were giving me feedback and their thoughts about, language learning, teaching, and how they wanted to be part of that process. So these were the questions that they were asking, what we call questions of mystery. And that was just a short introduction. And I always say, but wait a minute, isn't this supposed to be about planning and frameworks for, proven frameworks for teaching? Well, it is, but I just want to put that into perspective first, and that's why I said that, because here it is about planning for online instruction and using proven models that work for teachers, and for us to see ourselves as teachers, as designers of a learning process. But we need models, and we need proven models that work. But I wrote this many years ago because I felt that, planning is sort of like a journey. You're planning a journey. And if you really think it out, it's like planning a journey for the students. And where do you want to take those students? And we can still be creative as teachers, but we need models. We need something to help us to do that planning and designing. And what do we think about when we're really planning something, designing a class for that learner experience? And, I looked around and, sort of came up with these ideas of what we should consider when we're actually planning uh, for instruction. And it really doesn't make a difference if we're doing content instruction or language instruction, but these are some of the aspects that we really should consider when we're planning that class and designing it. Well, when we're planning and designing, we're going to have some challenges. And this is just a list of some of those challenges that we have. And I do want to point out that I'm, really referring more to the flipped classroom, online learning, and, maybe we might even get to the point of hybrid learning. But these are some of the challenges that we as teachers face when we're planning classes for our students and planning a positive learning experience for them. Well, the COVID situation threw us into a point of almost cognitive dissonance, and we were told we had to go online immediately. And then we were thrown all these ideas, and we saw just a jungle of things and webinars coming at us. And how are we going to integrate technology into this online learning experience and still make it a positive experience for our learners? And so we as teachers had to make many decisions on how we were going to effectively plan this class. And one of the things that really we as teachers had to face was our own digital literacy, not just the digital literacy of our students, but our own, and all the things and skills that we were going to have in order to design an instructional learning cycles online. And so these are some of the things that we had to consider here. But there was another little elephant in the room, and this digital literacy, as we call it, that elephant in the room was technology, and everybody started calling it sort of digital literacy. And as I pointed out, there are some, things that we as teachers had to face about digital literacy, but nobody was talking too much about the digital divide, and that's really parity, and also digital equity, which is inclusion. A lot of the things that we talk about, especially the ones that are very Eurocentric, the webinars that we saw were very Eurocentric, and we're considering all the different things that we had to consider, because not everybody has the equipment and the tech savvy that they're going to need to actually successfully participate in an online learning experience. But when we look at, what, we were thrown into this emergency online learning and designing for online learning and learning experiences, I want to take a few steps back and, ask ourselves, and we as teachers do need to ask ourselves, what were the lessons learned from this past year and a half as we were thrown into this online learning world? And what worked and what didn't work? Well, one of the things that we, should think about is when we're planning an online learning and teaching experience, it requires a shift in the way we think, this mind shift that has to be dealt with, and to break through the obstacles to learning and discover the hidden potential that we as teachers really have. And another thing that we also had to encounter was that maybe our approaches to learning are something that we also need to consider when we're working with young learners, teenagers, university students, and that we, take very pedagogic approaches to teaching teenagers, and that's okay. But we also need to think about the older teenagers, the ones reaching 17, 18, 19, and getting ready for university, and university students, and incorporating andragogic approaches to learning, and hopefully lead them to self-directed, which of course is pedagogy. And my God, when people hear these words, they think, well, I just thought it was all pedagogical, but it's not. And we need to consider these things when we're planning and designing for our learners. Another thing is, taking the learners into consideration and getting them involved in their learning process and assigning roles and responsibilities to them. So I created this model right here. Actually, it's the model that I gave to the International Teachers Associations to help them plan their online learning workshops, to move it from just talking heads and webinars to really a very interactive approach to learning online. So, here you see a model that we use to make sure that the students are really involved in taking responsibility and self-directedness, leading them to self-directedness online. Another thing that we need to look at is the model of 21st century skills. And, I don't want to get too much into that because we do know what the 4 Cs are. But the only question we have to ask ourselves is, are we integrating that into the design of the learning experience? Well, we start here with something that everybody knows about. What about Bloom's taxonomy and what role does that play in design? Well, I think that that's one of the more important models that we have to look at. When I meet teachers and have traveled all over the world, I always see that they never even heard sometimes of Bloom taxonomy, but it is a very important model to know, to learn and understand and integrate into how you design classes, whether that be face-to-face or online. Another thing I always ask teachers is, what is your TPAC? Have you considered that? And here is a graph, a chart of what TPAC really is. TPAC is the acronym for technology and pedagogy and content knowledge. And this was something that we found was actually the biggest problem when we're thrown into the emergency online learning, and how we developed that very quickly, because questions came up of what works in the face-to-face class might not work in the online learning experience. And so, questions of pedagogic knowledge really came up. We were good at content and good at presenting that and working with it in a face-to-face learning environment, but would that really work in the online learning experience? So of course, here you see a model that I created for myself and that I show to teachers about what my TPAC is and how I integrate the different apps and different technologies into the learning experience. So here you see sort of a very practical, I created this for myself, but I do require my teachers to create a TPAC model for themselves and explain it to me and their students in order to make sure that the students are going to feel a sense of efficacy or success during the online learning experience. Now, when we get to older models, one of the things that's very important in the European community is the methodology of CLIL. And if you are working with textbooks, you'll know that the more revised textbooks you always use a CLIL approach. So if you're using a textbook-driven methodology in your classroom, you should be able to understand what CLIL is. But many teachers still have a problem really understanding it because there's so many different explanations of it. But just like we have the 4 Cs of 21st century learning, we also have the 4 Cs of CLIL, which are communication, cognition, culture, and content. And to take that one step further, here you see really what that is, because if we talk about skills in CLIL, we're talking about speaking, writing, listening, and reading, and vocabulary and grammar. And those are the 6 aspects that every textbook has. And teachers like to use textbook because it involves all of those skills. But there's a little bit more to that. And another thing that I discovered in very early in my career when I started doing instructional design was that CLIL was a fantastic framework to work with, but it left something out, and that was task-based learning. And here we see just a definition by one of my colleagues here for task-based learning, and that simple definition of learning by doing. That's what task-based learning was. Well, I soon discovered that it's not so simple. Sometimes it's just learning by doing. So I did a little bit of an investigation into task-based learning and combining that with CLIL. And then here I run across, Merrill's principles of instruction, where Merrill says that, just throw the students into problem solving, give them a task, and they'll be able to do it in the language and through the production of a product within the task-based learning cycle, that they'll be able to acquire the language in a natural way. Well, that sounds good, but that might not always work for everybody, especially learners from a lower level. Task-based learning becomes a little bit complicated for them. It's only when you get to a really higher B1 that you can effectively integrate task-based learning into the language learning process. So Merrill is right about some things, but it's not applicable to many of the language levels that we're dealing with, especially when we're dealing in the classroom with differentiated learning. Well, we get into some classic models like the ADDIE model. Looks very complicated, and there's books written about it. There's so much research about it. It's wonderful, it's fantastic, and it is, but it can be overwhelming for many teachers. So here we see a more simplified form of what the ADDIE model is for instructional design: analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. Well, some of the pros, there's many pros and cons to the ADDIE model, but one of the biggest, questions that teachers had with the ADDIE model was that evaluation came at the end. And we see with more modern, contemporary approaches to teaching and learning that we should not really put evaluation at the end. Another word for evaluation is assessment. That we need to really see evaluation in the middle of everything. And it's the thing that we should be working everything around. So now there's a revised model of ADDIE, where evaluation and assessment comes in the end and at many different steps throughout really the instruction, online learning, face-to-face experience. Another thing that we need to think about when we're really planning and designing, it's called the constructive alignment model for instructional design, where there's three aspects of really instructional design. One of them is what are the learning outcomes, and learning assessment, and teaching methodologies that we're going to actually use. And I liked this very much. But then one of my colleagues asked me, Ron, that works well, but there's a little bit more to that. And there's some aspects missing when you really take the backward design. And we talked about it, and then that led us to, the Delta process, which, yes, we take into consideration the constructive alignment aspects of outcomes assessment and design, but we need to add the curriculum context. What context are we really working within, and also reflection, that metacognitive aspect that's really important when we're doing that. Metacognitive can be simple things like formative assessment, but metacognitive means getting students to think about their learning and how they're really progressing and how they see that progression in order for them to reach a point of efficacy. Another thing that we need to think about when we're thinking about planning a class is performance-based learning. And this right here is just a fantastic thing to integrate into the instructional design process, because here we can kill many birds with one stone when we integrate performance-based learning as a way of formative assessment and also summative assessment. Many teachers feel a little bit uncomfortable with performance-based learning because the students have a voice in exactly how they're going to perform a task, and they also have a voice in how it's going to be assessed. Now, when we're doing exam-oriented learning, and we know that we have to prepare students for a test, some teachers say, that doesn't fit into the way we have to do things. but it can. If you just give students a chance and believe in them, you'll see that it works very well. And we can still prepare students for exams effectively and successfully by integrating performance-based learning at intervals throughout the learning process. We also need to think about the flipped classroom and really what is the flipped classroom and how does flipped learning work? Well, another thing that we never really consider when we're talking about the flipped classroom is that we're dealing with synchronous and asynchronous learning. And that means that we have to change the way we approach learning. Many teachers think that learning happens right there in the classroom and forget that more learning happens outside the classroom and the social aspects of learning. So if we're going to integrate flipped learning and the flipped learning model into how we design our classes, we do need to take into consideration the synchronous aspects and the asynchronous aspects. Well, that leads us to the inquiry-based approach and how we integrate the inquiry-based approach. And this was really a big step for me as I started to really think about how I designed classes and what were successful and what were not successful classes. And I found that the more successful classes were the ones that I had integrated the inquiry-based model into the design of the classes and the implementation. Now, the inquiry model, deals with exploring, creating, investigating, and processing. But this is the aspect of design from the aspect of the teacher, but it's about the learner. And so we got to move it from the teacher to the learner and move it to them and what they think and how they wonder and investigate and record and things that are happening within the inquiry-based model. And I think this is a great way to really see that and change the perspective of the inquiry-based approach when you integrate that into the design and implementation of your classes. Well, that moves us to PBL and what really is PBL. And again, I feel that this is one of the more higher forms that we need to be integrating into the design of our classes. This model that you see here was created by the Buck Institute in the United States and is the model used throughout the world for integrating PBL. I ask you to all please go to Google and Google the Buck Institute and PBL, because you will find some wonderful ideas of how to integrate PBL into your learning cycles, whether that be face-to-face or online. Well, there's mindsets have to be changed. Many different things have to be considered when a teacher starts to work with PBL, because it does change the way you instruct and teach, whether that be face-to-face online or online. And these are some of the 10 aspects that we need to think about and change sometimes in order to effectively integrate PBL into our face-to-face or online learning experiences that we're having with students. And here we see some of the wonderful benefits that the students can have from PBL. Uh, but when I reached the point of successfully integrating PBL and TBL into my lessons, I was encountered with something else. And that was, how do I make these complicated methods and approaches and, instructional design easy for the teachers that were, working with me? And that's why I came up with the mind map concept of teaching and learning, because, students and learners need visuals and graphic facilitation to help them to understand what's going on and give them a roadmap to the learning process and where are they at. And what you're looking at here is I combined TBL and PBL and the inquiry-based approach into just one visual without ever explaining that to teachers or students. And I tested it to see if it worked with thousands of students and hundreds of teachers, and we found that it worked well. And what you don't see here, of course, is performance-based learning, because it does have to be assessed. Well, that leads us to the hybrid model. And really, we will never be able to get to this point. We hear this so much, going on about what really is hybrid learning. We will not get to that point, and many universities are trying to reach that point. There's many barriers to overcome, but before we could ever reach as a teacher, as an individual, as someone who wants to develop ourselves and see ourselves as a contemporary teacher, we're going to have to look at some of the models that I've presented to you before, and really look at how we understand that and how we integrate that into the way we plan our learning cycles for our students. Uh, because the hybrid model is one of the more complicated models and requires teachers to have a high sense of technical know-how, and methodology know-how in order to really reach hybrid, because what we did in face-to-face is not the same thing as what's happening online. And in order to really get a good, hybrid model, we as teachers need to develop ourselves and the other frameworks that I presented to you so that we can reach a point of being able to teach and use the hybrid model, which of course is a combination of all the models that I showed you. I'd like to wrap it up and say that uh, yes, it might sound a little bit overwhelming, but if we just take a couple of steps back, look at some of the things that I presented to you and think about, are we using them? Maybe you are. Maybe you just didn't know that you were doing it. Uh, but really take a step back and ask yourself, am I doing it right? And reflect, not only expect your students to reflect on their learning, but for you as a teacher to reflect on your own teaching. And sometimes we need those models in order to reflect, because we need something to really get to the point of questioning what we do and how we do it. I believe that the most important thing that we as teachers need to really think about and consider is the importance of self-directed learning. Because if this is really what we think about when we're planning something, isn't it something that we want our students to be self-directed and planning? We want our students to be self-directed learners and drive their own car, be responsible for their own self-development, and creators of content instead of just giving them content to digest. We want them to be critical thinkers, decision makers. We want them to be problem solvers and risk takers. We want them to be fact formers. We need them to also think of in the sense of, process oriented, and not just content creators, and them, digesting what we give them, but really understand the process that they're involved in for their self-development, because it's through that and understanding the process that we turn our students into lifelong learners. I do believe that if this is our goal, that we want self-directed learners, then we need to design our courses around that concept of self-directed learning and to meet the students' needs, not just for now, but for the future. I want to thank you very much for coming today. And I would like to turn this back over to Alexi. And if you want more information, please follow me on social media, where I reach over 3 million teachers every week. I use my Facebook account and my VK account as a way to reach teachers all over the world, sharing my years of experience with them, and give you a lot of information that you can really access very easily in order to do self-directed learning for yourself. Thank you.